The dust of 3 years and 1,000 miles clung to Jonah like a second skin. It was in his throat, in the lines around his eyes, and caked on the worn leather of his gun belt. His horse, a weary roan named Dust Devil, lowered its head as they crested the final rise. Below them lay the small ranch he had bought with the only clean money he'd ever made, a square of hard-won dirt carved out of the vast, unforgiving Wyoming territory. He had left it in a hurry, chasing a debt of honor that had turned into a long, bloody shadow. Now, returning, he expected to find what the wilderness always delivered to the untended: ruin. He expected collapsed fences, a cabin stripped by wind and wanderers, a well choked with tumbleweeds. What he saw made him pull the roan to a dead stop. The cabin stood firm, its windows clean. The corral fence was not just standing, but mended with fresh-cut pine. A plume of smoke, thin and gray, rose from the stone chimney, a sign of life he had not dared to imagine. And in the small patch of land beside the cabin, where he'd once tried and failed to grow anything but rocks, was a garden. It was neat and green, rows of beans and squash thriving under the relentless summer sun. A figure was bent over in the garden, a spot of impossible color against the brown earth. It was a woman, wearing a dress of dark, deep blue that seemed to drink the light. A cold knot of suspicion tightened in his gut. A squatter. Or worse. He urged the roan forward, the familiar weight of the colt at his hip a grim comfort. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. The woman was not American. She was Chinese, her black hair pinned up in a severe, elegant knot. The dark blue dress was a cheongsam, high-collared and simple, its fabric out of place and yet perfectly poised in the rugged landscape. She straightened as she heard his approach, her movements fluid and unhurried. She was young, perhaps 25, with a face that was calm and serious. She held a small trowel in one hand, her knuckles smudged with dirt. Jonah swung down from his horse, his boots sinking into the soil he knew as his own. He felt the grit on his teeth as he spoke, his voice a low rasp from disuse. "This is my land." The woman's dark eyes met his. There was no fear in them, only a quiet assessment. She looked at his haggard face, the sun-bleached hair falling over his forehead, the exhaustion etched into him so deeply it looked like part of his bones. She did not look at the gun on his hip. She looked at him, the man, and saw something beyond the dust and the danger. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging his statement without agreeing or disagreeing. Then, she set the trowel down on a rock beside the garden path. Her English was clear, with a soft, precise accent that was as unexpected as the garden itself. "You have traveled far," she said. It was not a question. She wiped her hands on a small cloth tucked into her sash and moved toward the cabin's porch. Jonah's hand stayed near his colt, his body coiled with the readiness of a man who had survived by expecting the worst. He watched her every move, waiting for the trick, the sudden appearance of a husband or a brother with a shotgun. But she just stepped into the cabin's shade, her back to him for a moment, and then re-emerged. She said nothing more about the land, about his claim, about the gun he was all but holding. Instead, she looked at him again, her gaze direct and unnervingly calm, and asked the last question on earth he had expected to hear. "Have you eaten?" The words hit him with a physical force. They were simple, practical, and so profoundly out of place in the confrontation he had been prepared for that they disarmed him completely. He had been ready for a fight, for threats, for a legal battle over a deed. He had not been ready for an offer of hospitality. He stared at her, the suspicion in his mind warring with a hunger so deep it was a constant, dull ache behind his ribs. He hadn't had a real meal, one that didn't come out of a can or wasn't cooked over a smoky campfire, in weeks. He could not remember the last time someone had asked him that question with genuine concern. "No," he managed to say, the word scraping its way out. She nodded again, as if this confirmed her initial observation. "Come inside." "There is stew." She turned and disappeared into the cabin, leaving him standing in the yard with his horse, the dust, and a confusion so profound it left him motionless. For a long moment, he did not move. His instinct screamed at him. It was a trap. A trick. But his body, weary and starved, betrayed him. The smell of stew, rich with meat and vegetables, drifted from the open doorway. It was the smell of a home, a life he had forgotten could exist. Slowly, deliberately, he unbuckled his gun belt and draped it over his saddle horn. Then, leaving his past hanging in the sun, Jonah walked toward the cabin. The inside of the cabin was as surprising as the outside. It was spare but immaculate. The floor was swept clean, a simple rag rug lay before the hearth, and a small clay pot on the windowsill held a spray of wild bluebells. His old rocking chair was still by the fire, but it was draped with a finely embroidered silk shawl. A small table was set for one. The woman moved about the room with a quiet efficiency, ladling a thick, dark stew into a bowl. She placed it on the table with a slice of coarse bread and a tin cup of water. He sat down heavily, his long frame awkward on the small wooden chair. He watched her, but she did not watch him. She moved to the dry sink, her back to him, and began to wash the dirt from her hands. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of water splashing gently into the basin. He picked up the spoon. The first mouthful was a revelation. It was rabbit, he thought, with potatoes and wild onions, seasoned with something he didn't recognize, something warm and earthy that chased the trail dust from his palate. He ate like a starving man, his head down, not stopping until the bowl was clean. He sopped up the last of the gravy with the bread and washed it all down with the cool well water. Only when he set the cup down did he look up. She was sitting across from him now, her hands resting in her lap. Her name, she told him, was Mai. Her husband, Lynn, had purchased the deed to this ranch a year ago in the town of Redemption, from a man named Bartholomew Reed. Lynn had been a clerk for the railroad, a man who saved every penny with the dream of owning a piece of land, a place to build a life away from the noise and the prejudice of the railroad camps. They had arrived last spring. But the mountain fever had taken Lynn before the first snows fell. As his widow, the territorial homestead laws granted her full ownership of the claim. She had the deed, signed and stamped, locked in a small wooden box. Jonah listened, a cold stillness settling over him. He knew the name Bartholomew Reed. Reed was the most powerful man in Redemption, a land broker who owned the bank, the general store, and held the mortgages on half the county. He was a man who smiled while he bled you dry. He told your husband the land was abandoned, Jonah said, his voice flat. Part of a railroad grant that was never claimed. Yes, Mai said. He said the owner had died in a mining accident years ago. He had the paperwork from the territorial office. Jonah reached into the inner pocket of his worn duster. He pulled out a folded, oilskin wrap packet. His fingers, calloused and scarred, carefully unfolded the document inside. It was his own deed, the original homesteader's claim, filed and recorded for years ago. He had carried it with him through every gunfight and every lonely campfire. He pushed it across the table. The owner didn't die, he said quietly. He just went away for a while. Mai looked at the paper. Her expression did not change, but he saw a flicker of understanding in her dark eyes. She looked from his deed to his face, and for the first time, he saw not a squatter, but a woman as trapped as he was. They were two people on opposite sides of a lie crafted by a man in a town miles away. She had paid for this land with her husband's life savings. He had paid for it with his own blood and sweat. And Bartholomew Reed held them both in his hand. He cheated us, she said, her voice barely a whisper. That's what he does, Jonah replied. The weariness returned, heavier than before. He had come back looking for a place to rest, to finally be done with fighting. But the fight had followed him home. Or rather, it had been waiting for him all along. He couldn't blame her. He saw the strength in her posture, the resilience in the neat rows of her garden. She had survived a winter alone out here, had held on to this place with nothing but her own two hands. He couldn't just throw her out. But he couldn't walk away, either. This was his land. The only thing in the world that was his. I'll sleep in the barn, he said, pushing his chair back. Tomorrow, I'll ride into Redemption and talk to Mr. Reed. Mai looked at him, a silent question in her eyes. She was wondering, he knew, if he was a man who talked with words or with the colt he'd left on his saddle. He wasn't sure he knew the answer himself anymore. He had come home to escape that choice. He walked out of the cabin and into the fading light, the taste of the first real meal he'd had in months still on his tongue. He felt the weight of the debt he now owed her for that simple kindness. In the barn, he found a clean stall filled with fresh hay. Even the barn was clean, the tools oiled and hung in their proper places. She had cared for this place. She had made it a home. And now, he realized, he would have to fight for it all over again. The next morning, Jonah rode into redemption. The town hadn't changed much. It was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, all of them looking a little tired under the morning sun. But the office of Bartholomew Reed was new. It was a 2-story brick building, the only one in town, a monument to his prosperity. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of polished wood and money. Reed was a large man, dressed in a fine wool suit despite the heat. He had a perfectly trimmed beard and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He recognized Jonah the moment he walked in. Well, well. Jonah. Back from the dead, are we? I heard you'd run into some trouble down in the Colorado Territory. I'm a hard man to kill, Jonah said, his voice level. He walked to the desk and laid his deed down on the polished surface. This is my land. You sold it to a man named Lynn. Reed didn't even glance at the paper. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. Ah, yes. The Chinaman. A tragedy, what happened to him? A shame. As for the land, my records show it was an abandoned claim. The territorial office confirmed it. I merely facilitated its transfer to a new owner. A widow, I believe. A very vulnerable woman, all alone out there. It would be a terrible thing if she were to be displaced. The threat was clear, wrapped in a silken package of false concern. Reed was not just a cheat, he was a predator. He preyed on the weak, the isolated, the people the law tended to overlook. People like a Chinese widow. And people like a gunslinger with a reputation, a man the local marshal would be happy to see locked up or run out of town. Your records are wrong, Jonah said, his voice dangerously quiet. Reed smiled. Paperwork can be so confusing. But the law is the law. The deed filed most recently with the county clerk is the one that stands. And that would be Mrs. Lynn's deed. The one I sold her. Unless you have a more compelling argument. He gestured vaguely toward Jonah's hip, where a gun would normally be. Jonah had deliberately left it at the ranch. He knew this fight wouldn't be won that way. Winning it that way would only prove Reed's point and land him in a cell. I'll be back, Jonah said. He turned and walked out, the smug smile of Bartholomew Reed burning into his back. Outside, he saw the town marshal, a portly man named Calloway, leaning against a post, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. Calloway glanced at Jonah, then at Reed's office, and a look of understanding passed between him and the man inside. The whole town was in Reed's pocket. Jonah rode back to the ranch with a cold fire in his belly. He had faced down men with guns, had survived ambushes and standoffs. But this was different. This was a fight against paper and power, a battle he didn't know how to win. When he arrived, Mai was waiting on the porch. She must have seen the answer in his face. He will not listen, she said. No. He owns the town, the marshal, everything. He thinks we're two loose ends he can sweep away. That evening, they sat at the small table again. The silence was different now. It was not the silence of strangers, but of allies facing a common enemy. Mai told him more about Lynn. He had been a scholar in his home country, a man who loved books and poetry. He had come to America for the promise of a future where he could be more than just a laborer. He had believed in the law, in the power of a signed contract. He had been a good man, a gentleman. And Bartholomew Reed had crushed him. Jonah found himself talking, too. He told her why he'd left. Not for a debt of honor, as the stories went, but because he had killed a young man in a stupid, drunken gunfight. The boy had drawn on him, but Jonah had been faster, colder. He had seen the life go out of the boy's eyes and had seen himself for what he was, a man whose only skill was death. He had ridden away from that memory for 3 years, trying to outrun the ghost. Coming back here was supposed to be the end of that life. "You are not that man anymore," Mai said softly, looking at his empty gun belt. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I know I can't let Reed take this place from you. From us." The next day, 2 men rode out to the ranch. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced riders from the saloon, the kind of men who worked for men like Reed. They didn't dismount. They sat on their horses at the edge of the garden, their presence a deliberate violation of the peace. "Reed sent us," the leader said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Mai's bin plants. "He says the lady has 2 days to pack her things and clear out. He's got a new buyer lined up." Jonah stepped out onto the porch. He was unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. "This is my property. You're trespassing." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This ain't your property, gunslinger. The paper says it belongs to the little lady. And Reed says she's leaving. We're just here to make sure she understands." The second man uncoiled a rope from his saddle. "Might be a shame if that well got fouled. Or if a fire was to start in that nice, dry barn of yours." Jonah felt the old, familiar coldness wash over him, the feeling that came before a fight. But he held it back. He looked at the men, then at Mai, who stood just inside the doorway, her face pale but resolute. He had to be smarter than them. "There's a U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne," Jonah said, his voice calm and steady. "They've got a telegraph line there now. It's amazing what a few dots and dashes can do. A federal inquiry into fraudulent land claims, for instance. Reed's name has come up before, I hear. They'd be very interested in his paperwork. Especially when 2 deeds exist for the same property." The lead rider's smirk faltered. He knew about the telegraph, but he hadn't considered this angle. Reed's power was local. A U.S. Marshal was a different animal entirely. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Jonah took a step forward. "You can go back and tell Reed he has 2 choices. He can buy back the deed from Mrs. Lynn for the full price she paid, plus another $500 for her trouble, and tear up his forged copy. Or he can wait for the marshal. Either way, you 2 are leaving my land. Now." The men exchanged a nervous glance. They were paid to intimidate a lone woman, not to get tangled up in a federal investigation. After a tense moment, the leader grunted, wheeled his horse around, and they rode off in a cloud of dust. Jonah watched them go, his body trembling slightly with the adrenaline. He had won, for now. But it was a bluff. He had no idea if the marshal in Cheyenne would listen to him, and the journey there would take days, leaving Mai vulnerable. He turned to Mai. "We need to make it real." That night, they made a plan. Cheyenne was too far. But a new telegraph station had just opened in Laramie, a day's hard ride away. If he left before dawn, he could get there, send the message, and be back before Reed even knew he was gone. But it was a risk. Mai would not hear of it. "He will have men watching the road," she said. "You will not make it," she thought for a moment, her gaze distant. "My husband had a friend who runs a freight wagon. He brings supplies from Laramie every week. His name is Mr. Chen. He is a good man. He will be passing by the South Road tomorrow morning, far from town. He can take the message for you." It was a better plan. Safer. The next morning, long before the sun rose, Jonah wrote out a careful, detailed message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Cheyenne, citing both deed numbers and accusing Bartholomew Reed of fraud. He gave it to Mai, along with a small pouch of money. "Give this to Mr. Chen. Tell him it's a matter of life and death." She nodded, her face grim in the pre-dawn light. "Be careful, Jonah." he spent the day working on the fences, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, every muscle tense for a fight. He expected Reed's men to return, angrier this time. But the day passed in watchful silence. Mai returned just after noon, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Chen took the message," she said. "He will send it from Lamy." And so they waited. The 2 days of Reed's ultimatum came and went. Nothing happened. A week passed. The work of the ranch went on. Jonah mended the roof of the barn. Mai tended her garden. They fell into a rhythm, a quiet partnership born of necessity. They ate their meals together, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence. He found himself admiring her resilience, her gentle but unbreakable spirit. She had a way of making the harsh landscape seem less menacing, of coaxing life from the stubborn soil. The cabin no longer felt like his empty shelter, it felt like her home. Then, one afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. But these were not Reed's men. They wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. They rode straight to the cabin, their faces stern and businesslike. The senior marshal, a man with a graying mustache and tired eyes, dismounted. "I'm looking for a man named Jonah and a woman named Mai Lin," he said. Jonah stepped forward. "I'm Jonah. This is Mrs. Lin." The marshal nodded. "We received a telegraph. We've spent the last 3 days in redemption, going over Mr. Bartholomew Reed's books. It seems your claim was not the only one he mishandled." He pulled a document from his bag. "The territorial court has voided the fraudulent deed. This property is legally yours, Jonah. And Mr. Reed is on his way to Cheyenne to stand trial." The relief was so sudden and immense that Jonah felt his knees go weak. It was over. The fight was won, not with a gun, but with a few words sent over a wire, and the quiet courage of a woman who refused to be broken. The marshals didn't stay long. They tipped their hats and rode back toward town, leaving a profound quiet in their wake. Jonah and Mai stood on the porch, watching them disappear. The land was his again. But it felt different now. He turned to her. "This is your home, Mai. You saved it. You and Lin." She looked up at him, a small, rare smile touching her lips. "We can share it. There is much work to be done before winter." And so they did. Summer bled into a golden autumn. Jonah worked the land, his hands growing calloused from the handle of an axe instead of the butt of a gun. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. He was building something, not tearing it down. Mai managed the cabin, the garden, and the finances with a sharp mind and a steady hand. They were partners in every sense of the word. The ghosts of his past began to quiet, replaced by the simple, solid reality of a day's hard work and a shared meal at night. One evening, he came in from the corral, tired, splattered with mud, and bone-deep satisfied. The air was crisp with the coming cold, and the cabin was a beacon of warmth and light. He walked inside, stamping the dirt from his boots. Mai was at the stove, stirring a pot that filled the room with a rich, savory aroma. She turned as he entered, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She looked at him, at his tired but peaceful face, and her smile was warm and familiar. It was the smile of a person who was exactly where she belonged. "Have you eaten?" she asked. The question was the same one she had asked a lifetime ago, when he was a stranger full of dust and suspicion. But now, the words were different. They were not an offering to a traveler. They were a welcome. They were the sound of a man who had finally, after a lifetime of running, come home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.